Hey guys, this is Meeker here. I haven't done one of these videos in a while, but with the new expansion kind of up and coming, I wanted to talk about what is played in terms of PvP right now, in terms of what builds are broken, which builds are strong, which are average, weak, and then which ones you should generally avoid. This is kind of probably 3 to 4 months worth of culmination of like builds with the recent patches. There was a recent patch that did get released, or that's getting released tonight, that is nerfing the spear a little bit. So I'm gonna do this patch as if I'm gonna pretend that that patch didn't happen. I'm gonna rate builds that have been played and that probably will be played at the next patch because the spear nerfs don't look too significant, but are present with the next meta. I'll organize these into kind of some categories here, but I'm going to go into more specifics when I put them into the category on the left in terms of which builds are meta and like which ones are like really, really good, which ones are just played because there's not much else that can be played. I'm going to go through viable builds that have been played at some point within the last 2-ish months, and then I'm going to go through some off-meta builds that I wouldn't say are super popular right now, but have been played at some point within like the last 6-ish months. I am missing some like assassin oriented builds on here because there's a lot of different variants that have effectively been removed from the game. Like BB Warhammer, for example, has effectively been removed from the game because its combo is no longer possible, so it doesn't really make sense to run that weapon uh, or that entire class as a whole. So without further ado, let's kind of get into it. In terms of like heavy SNS IG, this build I wouldn't say is broken right now, but I'd say it's strong. I I would say before this build was more so on towards the broken side, but it has fallen off as of recently because of the recent changes and the recent changes to detonate don't make it so it doesn't hit as hard. It's just a solid build that you kind of want to have one of in pretty much every single army on the point. It's a build that can hard carry because you can lock down the bead choke, and it's just overall a pretty solid build, but I wouldn't say it's anything like super special. Moving on to Great Axe Warhammer, this build I would used to think that this build was broken. It was probably broken for a very long period of time. I'd say this build is strong right now. I wouldn't say it's broken per se. The damage from medium Great Axe Warhammer is there, but the actual kind of kill potential from the class is not, and that's the thing that lacks the most. This class tends to do well when coordinated with large armies, but in terms of like kind of solo play, I wouldn't say is nearly as like potent as it used to be. It's still kind of a necessary thing to have though, because the synergy from Great Axe into Grav will or from Great Axe and Warhammer can just not be beat by any other weapon. And if it wasn't for that synergy, this build would probably be an average to weak tier build. But because of that inherent synergy in how comps are formed within war rosters and how dominant Great Axe Warhammer is within OPR, if you could play it effectively, I have to put this as a strong weapon still. Moving on to medium IGVG, this has been played for a very long period of time. I wouldn't say this build is doing particularly well right now. I'd say it's more so on the lines of average, but the main thing that kind of allows this build to succeed is the Ice Gauntlet has just very good utility, and VG puts you in a spot where you can effectively play for that Ice Gauntlet value from those showers. This class succeeds at locking people in place so that they can be killed by other people on your team, but I wouldn't say alone can do very much. It's kind of like an average build that you kind of need to run with the Great Axe Warhammer for it to get value, but it's not something that you necessarily want to run, but you just kind of need to. In terms of light Lifestaff Rapier, I would argue that Lifestaff Rapier is broken right now. This is a build that can effectively escape any cooldowns if used properly. I think at the highest level of gameplay, Lifestaff Rapier has the highest carry potential, but the problem is it relies on other people that are also on this class to play it very well. If you could kind of ping pong the heals and do very well with single target healing, it has very high carry potential. And I think you could see that in regions like EU right now, where people have less than 90 kills in a 30-minute war. That is like averaging like 3 kills for the entire army per minute. Like that's just extremely low, and this Lifestaff Rapier is one of the main reasons why. With the health buff too, this class has just gotten stronger. Light, I think, is inherently broken right now because you can get out of situations that you just can't get out of with any other class. And melee assassin is no longer viable, so the only thing this class is really worried about is ranged Pressure and disruptors, which if you play around it properly is not that big of a deal for this class overall, and I would say this is like a generally very strong class in the game right now. Uh, Moving on to medium spear greatsword. This is kind of a build that has sort of taken the meta by storm. I would say this is like in general like a pretty broken build right now. A spear just has insane utility because of all the slows that it has. It has really good disengages with skewer, and the greatsword also helps it disengage. The greatsword is more of a secondary at this current moment in time. I wouldn't say it itself is super strong. Very viable build in both OPR and War and 3v3s and 1v1s. It's just overall kind of a beast of a build that you can't really be sad about having someone run. Medium Spear Hatchet is also a build that is kind of like the Greatsword one that is run. This is a build that I would put in the strong category, not necessarily the broken category, because there's inherent mechanics to it that you have to master for this build to be better than other builds on this list. So with like Medium Spear Hatchet, you have to be able to do that. The Hatchet cancel where you can go further backwards on your social distance throw, and if you're good at that consistently, this build just instantly kind of shoots up into the broken category. But if you're not consistently good at that, I would say it's just a strong build. It's really good at getting into space, but I would say Greatsword is still in general a little bit better than Hatchet because Relentless Rush and or is just so good with that relentless freedom to get out of sticky situations and kind of bypass Ice Gauntlet showers that Hatchet would get caught from. Medium Spear SNS. I'd say this build is like more so average right now. It's mostly run for the aura on SNS. SNS, the change where you have a rend on your auto attacks instead of a slow, I think inherently makes it a lot weaker than it was before. And some people have tried creative ways to navigating around that. But Spear SNS as a whole is really good at locking people down, but it's not nearly as good at kind of contesting that space and maintaining the space as other builds on this list, so I have to kind of bump it down a little bit because of that. Light Bow Rapier is something that you see a lot of in wars right now. I would have to say this is like between broken and strong, but I more so lean to strong rather than broken. Bow is just provides a lot of DPS output. It can AoE. It can hit clumps very effectively. It could also kind of win 1v1s. It could escape whenever it wants. You know, now that I think about this more, this is probably a broken build. It's between broken and strong for sure. It's like kind of in that category, but it just does so many things well in every single mode that if you know the mechanics of it, it's inherently kind of stupid. I might backtrack on this a little bit and put it back into strong because if you don't know the mechanics of this build, it just inherently is not quite as good of a build to pick up as some of the other builds in this broken tree. It's kind of like the hatchet where you kind of have to know the bow animation cancels where you can use abilities to animation cancel your heavy attacks. You have to know the crouch cancel tech. If you are familiar with those techs and you master them, this is easily a broken build for them. But for the majority of the player base, I would just say this is a very strong build right now. A bow hatchet is kind of the same spot where this is like a very strong build, but if you know the mechanics, it's like kind of extremely broken. I'm more inclined to put this in the broken category over bow rapier because of the hatchet mechanics right now, where you can effectively use one ability to go about 15 meters back in one direction, which allows you to play a lot more aggro, allows you to take a lot more space, and kind of have that increase from DPS because Hatchet is just inherently just very solid as a choice right now. It's mostly, I'm thinking about the Hatchet is better than Bow in terms of survivability, but in terms of actually getting in there and doing DPS, I think the Hatchet's a little bit more consistent as well. You provide a little bit more value to your army as a whole with an infected throw. If you're playing in an OPR infected throw, it's just a very solid ability. It's kind of what every VG wants to have but doesn't have. I would argue that Hatchet is like a borderline better disease value than IGVG at this point because the Scream just typically doesn't hit that many people, but IGVG still kind of has to be slotted for that Nullifying Oblivion, which makes it a must-have thing in kind of a war situation and a very good weapon in OPR, but outside of that, IGVG falls off. Bow Hatchet, I think, is just solid everywhere, and it's kind of hard to ignore it. It's also very good in 1v1s and 3v3s because of Shirking Heals. Shirking Heals will proc off that light passive, which will allow you to heal more off of it, which can allow you to win a lot of duels that shouldn't typically favor you with this kind of light bow hatchet build. In terms of light musket rapier, this is a build that's kind of come about as of recent that I think is in the category between strong and broken, depending if you know the exploits. If you know the exploits, I would say this is easily a broken build right now. But for the majority of the player base, I would say this is a strong build. The bow hatchet is kind of the same way, but in terms of like having to know the mechanics for it to be strong, but I think Bow Hatchet's skill ceiling is so high that I have to put it in the broken category. But Musket Rapier, I would just say, is strong right now. The trick with the musket that I keep talking about, hoping that the devs will fix at one point, is that you can quickscope with it, and the effectively don't have the bloom, so you can have the accuracy that you had before and the damage that you had before with no consequence, which effectively makes that whole change to accuracy worthless. I don't know if the devs will ever fix it anytime soon, but I'm going to keep saying it until they fix it, in hopes that they will at some point, because they don't really pay attention to ways to submit bugs at this point, because it just doesn't exist. Moving on to Musket Hatchet, I would put this in strong as well, but a little bit above Musket Rapier, because the Hatchet can just let you live a little bit better than a Rapier can at ranged, as well as navigate around the battlefield a little bit better. Both of these weapons are good. I might more so like move the Rapier down a tier to like average, rather than being like strong and then Hatchet up a tier, just because these builds you typically want to be playing a little bit more so from range, and the Hatchet's just a little bit better in that situation, as well as like navigating around the map for longer distances than the Rapier. So I'd say the Hatchet's a little bit better than the Rapier, but both these builds are very solid builds to play. In terms of light fire staff, Ice Gauntlet, I have to put this in broken just because inherently it's a low skill floor, uh, or sorry, it's a high skill floor build with a lower skill floor compared to some of the other DPS weapons on this list. It's something that you can kind of pick up and you can just instantly get value off of, and also has a fairly high skill ceiling with a lot of combos inherent to its kit that are just in general get value. This did receive a little bit of a nerf with the detonate change, so it's no longer like a cheesy I can kind of one shot any clump I think about build, and I can pump out to 8 range damage from range. I think it will be good on the next patch as well, where resilient changes are incoming, but for now, it's just very solid. Your ults are very good. You have really high DPS potential. You have high burst potential. It's something that's kind of hard to hate. Light IGBB is a weird weapon because it's inherently difficult to use, but if you master it, I would say it's a very strong build. But for the average player right now, I'd say light IGBB is an average build. Light IGBB is just very strong if you master the mechanics, but there's bugs with it where the like splitting grenades do not consistently do damage. The trick with this is, I believe, is if you use a different gem than your damage type, or it's like something weird like that, where like if you have fire attunement, then you don't want a fire dot gem in it or something weird is what I've like one thing I've heard that kind of fixes the problem. Another thing I've heard is you just don't want your grenades to touch someone before they explode, and then that solves the problem. So there's a few different ways to go about fixing that bug. But the main thing that IGBB has in particular is that it can dish out high amounts of burst damage without much consequence if you position correctly. It's just difficult to position correctly, and that's what kind of makes it a little bit more of an average build on this list. It's also a build that's kind of heavily countered by melees being on it and ice showers being thrown on it. Just for some reason, a lot of people are afraid to look at IGBBs because if they hit you and you don't hit them, they are just going to ruin your day. So it's a build that very much so plays to ego the other players on your team and just get value off of that, winning those 1v1s. But if you are capable of doing that, this is easily a strong build. I wouldn't say it's broken, but I'd say it's a very strong build. Moving on to viable builds, heavy SNS Great Axe or Greatsword. I would say this is like a lower tier of strong builds. Uh, Probably a tier lower than SNS IG though. SNS IG, the inherent thing that makes it very OP is that it can't really die to most clumps. The thing that SNS Great Sword brings to the table is a large AoE slow. It's also able to disengage some clumps that are too big, and typically in war metas right now, clumps are so big that it is difficult to live sometimes on SNS IG, and in those spots where it's difficult to live on SNS IG because the clumps are just too big, SNS Greatsword feels like a get out of jail free card. So that's this weird spot where this is like nichely viable from a war standpoint. And OPR, I think this build generally feels better than heavy SNS Ice Gauntlet. On this list, heavy SNS Hatchet. A build that can live, I would say it's a little bit weaker than the Greatsword, but it's not super bad. I'd say it's like a lower tier of average to higher tier of weak, but I'd overall put it as a weak build. It's not something that's consistently played right now, but I think has potential because of bugs on Hatchet and because Infected Throw is just a solid ability. Heavy SNS Spear. I have this as two different categories here, as a tank and as a disruptor. As a tank, I would say this is a weak build. As a disruptor, though, this is like more so an interesting build where I would say it's an average build. It's a build that's like used to run at players in the front line and then be able to live, but it requires an extensive amount of healing. Given the right circumstances, I think this build is viable and has been played on EU mostly, not as much in NA, but given the poor hand, it just doesn't win as well as other builds. Heavy SNS Firestaff, I think it's a niche 1v1 and 3v3 build. But in those circumstances alone, it's like kind of a between a broken and strong category. In a war, though, this is like an avoid build, so it falls somewhere in between. I would say this is more so like an average tier build. It's just the fire staff burn ticks for some reason do a lot of damage even if you're in heavy and allows you to do significant damage while still being tanky in those circumstances. Heavy Great Axe Warhammer is something that has been or was meta at one point, fell off very hard, and I don't see it being meta anytime soon since the 300 con change. I would just say that this is like a very weak build. If you're gonna run something quirky and it's off meta for Great Axe Warhammer, I don't think this is it. Late Great Axe Warhammer's in a similar spot where I would say this is a very weak build. I would say go as far as saying this is a void build at this point in the game. A Great Sword is just too good to not run in a light class. And if you go this route, it's really awkward because you end up with like a situation where you're running light, typically with 300 con because people want that 300 con. If you don't go for 300 con, you go for like 300 strength, then at that point, you might as well just go Great Sword and try to get to 300 dex with a different weapon because it's just better. So I would just say this is something that is not really worth running right now. And then this is supposed to be Great Sword Warhammer, which is like a off meta build, but it's also an avoid. I've seen that a little bit in OPR, and I don't really want to talk about that much more than that. A heavy IGVG is a very viable build, but it's something that it's kind of a niche slot in a war. I would still say it's like a average slot in a war, but it's only slottable on point itself. Every other game mode, though, this is not a very viable build. I'd say it's weak overall. So I would more so say for the general population, this is a weak build, but in a war situation, it's an average build. It's kind of a must-have for a slot, but it doesn't per se do anything super effectively itself that makes it stand out compared to some other builds. It doesn't make it super flashy, but it's still like a build that you typically want to have. So maybe I won't put that as weak. It will just be a lower tier average, but it's like it's in that realm. Light IGVG at this point in the game is a build that is generally weak to avoid tier. I would say it's weak. There's a few ways to make this work. I'll go through some of them later on this list, but it's as a kind of a utility class, light doesn't really make sense because the dodge roll is affected by slows now, so it just makes it difficult to get in and out of clumps like it used to be. Light Lifestaff Ice Gauntlet's kind of a niche build that can be played in a war situation in a fort. It's also viable in a OPR. I feel like it's super viable in the gate situations because you can just kind of control those top zones very effectively with the Ice Gauntlet, and you can live pretty well with it. I'd say more so this is kind of an average to strong tier build, but I would probably incline to put it in average. Light SNS, a light Lifestaff SNS I'd say is a weaker build, but the main utility that you can get out of this is with the SNS, you have access to stuns, which could help you escape if you're going versus a single target player. It also will allow you to get 2 freedom off a weapon that typically you'd only get 1 freedom off of that passive, and you don't have to sacrifice your gear score for it. So if you want to like run light staff SNS is like an AoE healer, I don't think it's bad at all. I guess I forgot to put in here light life staff VG2, but I would say it's a general weaker build right now. But it's has been played on some servers, it's just not played on any big servers in NA or EU. It's mostly played on uh, alternative servers that just generally aren't as competitive. Viable in OPR for sure, but outside of that, I don't think it's very viable at the current state of the game. Medium Lifestaff Rapier, I would say, is also just a weaker build right now. A good and smaller scale, but other than that, it just doesn't do as well. Light bow spear is something that you see a lot in OPR. You also see it in 3v3 is kind of smaller scale. In those game modes itself, I would say it's a strong build. In a war situation, I would say it's between an average and a strong build. Overall, I'm gonna say this is like a little bit average to like above average build right now. I'd say the spear kind of carries it enough to be a strong build, but it's not uh as strong as the Rapier variant or the Hatchet variant. It lacks in that survivability a little bit more so, but it makes up for that with a little bit bonus to damage. And those slows from the spear can kind of set up your bow in ways that kind of make it possible to do things that you wouldn't be able to do with other weapons. Light bow, greatsword overall. Not the best build in the game, but you see it a bit in OPR. Before, this is like a stronger build in OPR, but since the greatsword nerfs have kind of come, I'd say this is more so an average build to a weak between that range. I would more inclined to put it in a weak state because the greatsword is in this current state can't really be used for heavy attacks because you just feel too squishy. So it's an awkward weapon that can be used to get out of situations, but it's not as good at getting out of situations for this particular class and how they play compared to bow or compared to rapier or hatchet. So I just say it's not great overall. A light bow musket. This is somewhere between an avoid and a weak tier build. I would say it's probably uh I don't know. It's like it's very greedy. When it works, but when it doesn't work, it's gonna fall flat on its face. I would probably say there's probably a way to make this work, but for most players, I would say it's an avoid build. It's just probably too greedy to be really played in any game mode in the current state of the game. You can't move very effectively at this build anymore because with the bow changes where you have to be at max stam to get that haste. I just don't see this being super consistent to be able to escape situations. I think you'll just get run down compared to other builds on this list. Medium Firestaff Ice Gauntlet. This is something I've seen played in EU in the past 2 months. I would say this overall is like an average tier build. The light Firestaff just feels like it plays that role a little bit better, can kind of control that edge. This kind of tries to play up the middle a little bit more so. And in that situation, I don't think it's as good as some other builds on this list for those specific roles. Light Firestaff Rapier is in a weird spot. I wouldn't say it's like the main thing that you get from running the rapier with this build is you could drop your con even lower than you would be able to normally, and you're able to live with that. But Ice Pylon's just way too good to really consider doing that right now, so I'd say overall that's just a weaker build. Medium Ice Gauntlet Blunderbuss. This is a build that like was very viable recently with the BB changes and with the changes to like range and how that works. I would say this is more so like a weaker build than the light variant of Blunderbuss. If you can master the light variant of Blunderbuss, it is a lower or it's a higher skill floor then the light variant is a lot easier to play, but in general just seems to get a lot less value in terms of scoreboard and in terms of like impact. It's like not felt as much. Heavy IGBB at this point is an avoid build. It's nichely played by a few shot callers still because they weren't super good at other builds in the game. So they just weren't able to adapt, but I would say that it's not really viable at this point in the game ever since the fortified nerfs have come out. Light IGVG with Blade is a niche assassin build that EU has been cooking up. I'd say this is a weak build, but a very fun build to play, and I would recommend playing it if you have the gear and you don't really care and you just want to have fun. It's a great build for that. Light Hatchet, Greatsword as an assassin setup. This is something that the Whelps plays right now. I'd say this is a weak build right now. I think range just outclasses melee nuker style builds and every other kind of assassin build is even lower than this. If you drop your con too low, you're just not able to live. And Greatsword's a good way to get out of dodge. Hatchet's a good way to do damage, and Hatchet can also get out of dodge. So it's like a spot where you can do well with this build if you know what you're doing. But I wouldn't say it's a good time to start getting into this build. Moving on to some off meta builds, heavy SNS VG. At this point, I have to put this as an avoid build. It's good at smurfing on people, but that's about it. So if I'm in like a war where I notice that I'm not really having to shield much because the other team's getting farmed, sometimes I'll just throw this on to have some fun. But even then, heavy SNS Greatsword I feel like is better at that because you can go for like more greedy pulls with the slowing rupture, and that will just get more value than the Void Gauntlet at this point. Void Gauntlet just feels weak with SNS ever since it didn't give a flat stam regen, and overall I would just say it's not a build that you typically want to run. Heavy BBVG is also an avoid build. I've played this for a bit of time, but in the past it was viable, but it was very niche. I would not say it's viable at the current state of the game because of how Fortify works, and if even in heavy, it doesn't feel like it does enough for BB to make it live. Medium Great Axe Hatchet. This is a build that was kind of like niche in the beginning stage of the game, and it's kind of fallen off a lot. I would say it's like a weaker build, but not a complete avoid, because Hatchet has mechanics that you can get away with playing kind of a more quirky weapon, but overall it's just something that you typically don't want to play. And then medium Greatsword Warhammer, probably somewhere between weak and avoid, kind of a niche OPR build. Medium Ice Gauntlet Spear, this is off meta, but weirdly not that bad to play in my opinion. I'd say this is like an average build, but it's off meta. Ice Gauntlet's just a very strong weapon. Spear is a very strong weapon. It's kind of hard to hate it. Maybe more so, like, it's between average and strong, but I'm going to be conservative with this and stick it in average. A heavy Spear Ice Gauntlet, I'd say this is a little bit weaker than the Spear IG and medium because you just feel a little bit more clumsy. You could hold a spot, but you can't really push in this space. So I'd say overall this is like a little bit on the weaker side. A heavy Firestaff, Lifestaff, niche OPR 1v1 kind of build, but again weaker. And then moving on to the last honorable mention on here, heavy SNS Great I would say this is below average, somewhere between below average and weak. I'm gonna elect to put it in average very conservatively. No, I'm gonna put it in weak. I think I've been being consistent with the rest of my rankings. I'd say this is weak, but it's this kind of a slept-on combo. I think at this point, but it relies on stacking a bunch of weakens that are effectively very strong in the current state of the game. But other than that, the build doesn't lack a lot of. It doesn't have a lot of synergy compared to some of the other builds that are on this list, and overall it's just like kind of lacks a little bit. Compared to something like a Warhammer, and also lacks a little bit on the SNS side, so it's not perfect. So this tier list definitely aligned more in the average to avoid category than the broken and strong. But I think this is overall pretty comprehensive of like where builds are in the current state of the game. A Lifestaff I think is like generally very strong right now. A Spear is very strong right now, Bow is very strong right now, and Firestaff is very strong right now, but everything else feels a little bit patty in nature and typically requires large amounts of synergy in order to get value, and most builds just fall into that kind of average to weak category, and there's a few builds that are standouts, but nothing itself feels super powerful right now with the kind of dilution of damage that has come through the increasing in the HP. And with that being said, I'll see you guys in the next video. I'm taking some space up here. We can stagger.
They can get past attack for this.
Look at that top, look at Lyre.
Okay, Nato. Yeah,
I'm on Lyre. Lyre.
Yeah,
good
nice.
Kill. April, watch that up.
They're soft pushing through B. They
have I bowed the bottom.
They have 4 healers that aren't protecting the B choke. 4 healers aren't protecting the B choke.
I'm gonna grab that outside here.
I'm trying. Oh shit. Respawn's 10 seconds, guys. 10 seconds.
1 minute.
Yeah, we're chilling.
Nice respawn.
I grab up.
Take a Jordan. I'm just pressuring healers.
I grab
outside
up.
choke. I grab up in time.
2.
Yep, just shielding
1.
this.
Respawn's now.
Alright, let's get the kills.
Let's get the kills. Look at back at point.
The kills inside you.
Look at Glaive. Nice.
Danny bottom range.
I'm on Danny. Danny can die here. Nice.
Guys, that was last respawn. Don't die.
GG.
Yeah, just fight it. Push 1B, push me.
Push me.
That guy just go flying.
I'm not dingo.
Ooh, fat pad. Holy shit.
Here, look at Deneen. Fuck Deneen. Chasing him. Holy shit, I got him.
Am I an asshole for just attacking your SNS over and over until his shield breaks?
No. He's on fucking stone form.
GG's.
GG's, boys.
That was a fun war.
GG, thanks for coming, guys.